king and queen had a lovely baby daughter whose name was Snow White. One day, the queen suddenly died, and the king was very sad. A few years later, however, he married again. The new queen was very beautiful, but also very haughty and very vain. She had a magic mirror, and when she looked into it to admire herself, she used to ask, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?" And every time the mirror would answer, "Noble queen, so grand and tall, you are the fairest one of all." But as the years went by, Snow White was growing into a beautiful princess. And one day, the magic mirror had to tell the queen that her stepdaughter was now the fairest in the land. The queen was furious. She sent for a huntsman and ordered him to take Snow White into the forest and make sure she would never come back. So the huntsman led the little princess into the forest. But when the moment came to carry out the queen's cruel command, he found he hadn't the heart to harm her. Instead, he just left her to wander alone in the forest. At first, Snow White was very scared, but the wild beasts took no notice of her, and she wandered on until she came to a tiny cottage. She knocked on the door. No one answered, so she went inside. In the cottage, everything was very dainty and spotlessly clean. A supper table was laid with 7 little plates, each with a little spoon, a knife and fork beside it, and 7 little drinking cups. 7 little beds with white counterpanes stood against the wall. By this time, Snow White was very tired and hungry, so she took a morsel of food from each plate and a sip from each cup. Then she lay down across the little beds and fell asleep. Now the cottage belonged to 7 dwarfs who worked all day in the mountains, digging for gold and silver. When they came home that night, they were very startled to find Snow White there. But when she told her story, they said she was welcome to stay as long as she liked. And so the princess stayed at the cottage, and in return for the dwarf's kindness, did all their cooking, cleaning, and mending for them. Every day when the little men went off to work, they warned her not to stray away into the forest or let anyone into the house. You see, they had grown very fond of Snow White and didn't want the queen to find her. Now the queen, thinking that the princess was dead, believed that she was now the fairest in the land. And so one day she asked her magic mirror just to make sure, and the magic mirror replied that Snow White was still the fairest and could be found in the house of the 7 dwarfs. Trembling with anger and jealousy, the queen decided that this time she would put an end to Snow White herself. First, she went down into the dark cellars of the palace and made some poison. Then she went to the orchard, picked a rosy apple, and put the poison inside it. Next, she filled a basket with apples and put the poisoned one on top. Finally, she disguised herself as a peddler, and with the basket of apples on her arm, set off into the forest. When she reached the cottage, the queen knocked on the door. Remembering the dwarf's warning, Snow White wouldn't open it, so the queen held her basket up to one of the open windows and offered Snow White one of the apples to taste. Of course, Snow White had no idea the apple peddler was really her jealous stepmother and saw no harm in the rosy apple offered to her, so she took it and bit it. And with that first bite, she fell to the floor as if she were dead. With a wicked laugh, the queen hurried back to the palace, quite certain that she was now the fairest in the land once more. dwarfs came home that night and found Snow White lifeless on the floor, they were heartbroken. She looked so pretty. They made a casket of glass and very tenderly laid her in it. Then they carried the casket to a clearing in the forest and put flowers round it. And the birds and animals of the forest came to add their tears to those of the little men as they wept for the friend they had lost. One day a prince came riding by, and seeing the little men sitting sadly around the glass casket, he got down from his horse. When he saw Snow White lying there, he knew at once that he loved her, and that he could not bear the thought of being parted from her. He begged the dwarfs to let him take the casket away with him. "I cannot live without looking at Snow White," he told them, "and I promise I will always honor and treasure her as my dearest on earth." The prince spoke so earnestly that the dwarfs took pity on him, and the prince called his men to bear the casket away on their shoulders. But as they started off, they stumbled over some twigs, and in so doing shook the piece of poisoned apple from Snow White's throat. This at once restored her to life, and she sat up and looked about her in amazement. The prince and the dwarfs were overjoyed, and the whole forest suddenly became a happy place again. Snow White fell in love with the prince at first sight, just as he had fallen in love with her, and so when he asked her to marry him, she agreed with all her heart. Away rode the prince and princess together, but not before they had invited the little men to the wedding and promised to visit them at least once a year. The prince's parents loved Snow White as soon as they saw her, and there was great rejoicing among the people. At the palace, the king and queen ordered a banquet to be prepared, and all the kings and queens from the other lands were invited to the wedding. Little knowing that Snow White was to be the bride, her stepmother, the jealous queen, arrived wearing her richest clothes and finest jewels. When she saw the bride, she stood rooted to the spot with surprise and terror. There was Snow White, in a beautiful gown, with a tiny crown on her head, and her long silken train was held by 7 little men. The queen found herself choking with rage, and her fury was so terrible that she fell down in a faint. But knowing the full story, nobody felt sorry for her, and even the news that she had died of shock failed to spoil the rejoicing and merrymaking. When the parties were over, the 7 dwarfs returned to their little house in the forest. Snow White kissed each of them goodbye and repeated her promise to visit them with the prince at least once a year. And that made the little men very happy, because they knew that Snow White would keep her promise. And she did.